Welcome to Global Politics Week 2. This week we're going to be talking about uh, concepts of discourse, power, and practices, and in relation to sort of a international relations theory called constructivism. So the theme for this week is called Constructing COVID-19 as a Global Event. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to the introductory lecture and week one's lecture that is already on Acorn, I would recommend that you do that prior to sort of listening to this, as sort of these kind of build on each other. The other sort of information for this week is that we're starting our discussion groups with Tuesday, so tomorrow and Thursday. I've already sent an email with groups in them, so if you're not sure what group you're in, you can send me an email and we can arrange it. Or, if you miss Tuesday for some reason, you can make an exceptional case to be on the Thursday class or vice versa, but it has to happen with permission from me. So that's the housekeeping stuff for the course. Let's start with this week's lecture, where we're asking a question. This is the question that we're starting with, which is that, is COVID-19 a modern pandemic? To answer that question, we have to understand, or we have to appreciate what we understand by the term modern. So what is modern? What is modernity? Modernity could be seen as, or being modern could be seen as, a temporal designation, sort of saying that we are modern or this is a modern time. Or it can be seen as a spatial designation that sort of say some places are more modern than others. In this class, in the way that we're using the term, we're starting with two related processes. On the one hand, we have European Enlightenment, that's sort of like a philosophical approach to thinking, reason, and rationale, and sort of like to understand the reasons behind human behavior. And the other one is the emergence of modern scientific reason over religious doctrine that sort of breaks the dogmatic understandings of transcendentalism and legitimacy at the sort of like by valuing ordinary everyday life. This kind of modernity, or understandings of modernity, sort of human nature, dualism, etc., becomes the foundations of the theories that some of the theories that we're going to talk about in this class, like liberalism, realism, and structuralism. But to understand modernity, we also have to look at the impact of modernity on contemporary international relations. So one important outcome of modernity is the separation of church and state, sort of how religion and politics become separate. So prior to that, whereas those two concepts were quite intertwined in the through sort of our understandings of sovereignty and legitimacy of sovereignty, sort of following modernity and enlightenment, there's sort of a divergence. A second sort of outcome of modernity, or impact of modernity, perhaps, is the rise of nationalism, and most commonly sort of associated with the French Revolution. And the sort of republicanism associated with it. But at the same time, the kind of nationalism, the brand of nationalism that emerges as a result of the secularization of politics and the removal of the state, is that sort of nationalism replaces religion as sort of the secular doctrine, secular religious doctrine. So rather than sort of fighting for God, we start fighting for the nation. And, the world wars become quite a good example of that. And another side of that nationalism is perhaps the sort of like ethno-nationalism, or more sort of violent forms of nationalism, as we see with like manifestations of border regimes and citizenship, etc. Even though today we can talk about the border walls and the global migration regime, the power of the citizenship regime becomes visible in things, historically at least, in moments like the Holocaust, where sort of removal of citizenship from a certain group of people, in this case sort of the European Jews of European descent and Roma, etc., sort of became the basis or the foundation of the Holocaust. So that is all to say, modernity is a particular brand of imagination, a particular understanding of human place in the world and our sort of social relations. It's a particular formation. And in many ways, it's actually in all ways, international politics is bound by our imagination. So whereas modernity is one kind of imagination, there are other kinds of imaginations out there too that we can think about. So Maybe we should sort of frame understand our sort of conversation through two separate questions. One is, what kind of world do we have now? So we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of states and sovereignty, etc., sort of building up to in the next couple of weeks, and sort of next week we'll be discussing imperialism as post-colonialism, and then sort of we're going to be building on nationalism, the state, and sovereignty, borders, etc., as sort of key concepts in contemporary international politics. But then, if we sort of stop there, we will be just discussing things as they are. And international relations theory is also a sort of an imagination exercise of different possibilities. So, at the same time, we're going to be asking throughout this course, what kind of world or worlds are or is possible? That's sort of like, echoing the mantra of World Social Forum of sort of early 2000s, 2010s, that sort of another world is possible, and that there are different kinds of world politics emerge as a result of thinking about the world from different perspectives. So, like, what would an indigenous world politics look like? What would a post-colonial world politics look like? What would a feminist world politics look like, etc.? So if imagination is our limit, then we should be asking questions like, what kind of world is possible? What stops us from reaching those worlds that we're imagining? And, especially with things like climate change, there's a sort of perhaps a pressing need for, the future generations, including yours, to envision a different kind of future, a sort of perhaps a more, to use the buzzword, a more sustainable future. And in many ways, that imagination rests upon a particular dynamic, which is the power and knowledge dynamic. That is an interesting relationship, because perhaps we don't always think about the relationship between power and knowledge as sort of a central moment in world politics. But as French philosopher Michel Foucault argues, power and knowledge essentially is actually quite possibly the most important form of power, because the relationship between power and knowledge is used to legitimize discourses of normality. And in many ways, we define normal and then we define abnormal. So we define the norm and then we define the exception. And in many ways, that becomes the basis of world politics as we understand it. And then building on, in this week, we're also going to be looking at other key concepts in world politics, including power, discourse, and identity. So power is actually quite an essential concept in relation to what we talked about last class, last module, or last week, in relation to the structure and agency. Sort of an ability to affect someone else's actions, perceptions, and intentions is the sort of general definition of power. But power can manifest itself in many different ways. Power can be physical or military power in international politics. It could also be economic power. It could be institutional or bureaucratic power, but it also could be normative or cultural power. So let's just go through this and perhaps give some examples. An example of physical and military power would be, for example, to have nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are used in a sort of a dichotomy that we're going to talk about later in this term, called mutually assured destruction, where having nuclear weapons allows a sense of security because that they are such destructive weapons and that they can be used as a last case deterrence. So having nuclear weapons, there's an incentive in international politics, the way that we've structured it, to have nuclear weapons. Or economic power could be seen as, what China is doing today through something called the Roads and Belts Initiative, where they're sort of giving loans to other countries and building a global transport network that facilitates their trading power, trading purchasing power in the world. Institutional or bureaucratic power looks at the power of things like democracy, how we have developed the idea of democracy as a global norm, and we've promoted it for most of the period that we called globalization. And that sort of touches again on normative or cultural power, where we're talking about the Hollywood effect, or the ability to sort of have almost all top-ranking universities and knowledge centers in the world being in English-speaking countries or in English-speaking format. So those are the kinds of different power that sort of looks at power in many different ways. So in this class, I would like you to think power in sort of much more diverse ways. So rather than sticking to one of these definitions, maybe think about sort of how power impacts various different things differently, various different actors differently, and how it gives them different kinds of opportunities. So power is not something that exists sort of in a zero-sum way between two actors, and power is a sort of in international politics. Power is something that has a very diverse architecture. That sort of it's more of a rhizomatic or root-like structure than sort of like a one-on-one structure. So, and that's a really good example of perhaps why Donald Trump is having a hard time dealing with an actor like China, because in many ways, Trump's foreign policy is a much more sort of a single issue, case by case basis foreign policy, but forgets that sort of states often look at international politics as a long term game rather than a short term game. So sometimes they don't mind losing little things if in the long term it creates different kinds of opportunities. So it's important to understand those nuances in the architecture. But power also has, in that sort of knowledge and power relationship, a discursive element, a component that shapes our understandings of normal behavior. So to go back to this institutional or bureaucratic understanding of power, we can think of power as this ability or this sort of structure that shapes through institutional norms and institutional culture, whether that's a state culture or whether that's a societal culture, etc., our understanding of what constitutes normal. So international politics, it would be things like, the relationship between war and peace, which we're going to talk about in this class, and how you have to declare war before going to war. That's a norm of international politics that then sort of is, written into international law. But to understand that power-knowledge relationship, you also have to understand discourse. And discourses are practices that systematically form or create the objects that we speak of. So is there any meaning to peace without sort of like a discursive construct of us saying peace is good, right? Like you would find very few people in international politics that would argue that peace is not good. But you will find a lot of people that would argue that also that wars can be necessary. So in that discursive construct of positives and negatives in our interpretation, we come to the conclusion that nothing exists outside of language. We give meaning to things like the nation. We give meaning to things like the state and sovereignty. And another good example of that discursive construct would be to think about money, right? Like, so you might think that money is actually a material object, but if you sort of pick up a $20 Canadian bill, you will realize this is just a sort of a plasticky little piece of paper or plastic, whatever. What gives the meaning or what gives the value to that is your trust in the Canadian state and the Canadian institutions. So in many ways, it's through that trust and your understanding of what Canada is, what Canada stands for, you give meaning or value to the object or the practice. So that, like, outside of it, if you did not know what it was just a piece of plastic or a piece of paper. But the moment that you start giving meaning to it, you're giving it value. You're giving it value and you're giving it a performance. So then it starts becoming something else. That there's a difference between this piece of paper and a $20 bill. So it just becomes a thing. And at the same time, what I've just done is an action called deconstruction, where I'm taking the presumed meaning apart of these narratives, of these ideas, to show the inner workings of how something as common and everyday as currency works. And that often this activity also reveals internal contradictions and discontinuities, in the sense that sort of there's a difference, there's a sort of there's something sort of fake about money, in the sense that sort of, or there's something fake about currency. You have to believe in everything that is surrounding the state to believe in currency. That's why you yourselves can't sort of print your own money, except something like Bitcoin presents a challenge, right? Bitcoin is the sort of like alternative to existing sort of legal tenders as a main challenger right now. And in many ways, that challenge is happening because of the trust that you place on the sort of closeness of the this technology, the sort of what is the technology word that I'm looking for? Blockchain. that you're sort of trusting the blockchain technology around Bitcoin to sort of say that, okay, this is trustworthy. And the more people invest in Bitcoin, the more people buy Bitcoin, and given that there's a limited number of Bitcoins available, the value of the currency goes up. But there's other kinds of cryptocurrencies that don't get that kind of respect or that kind of value because the trust that we as a collective place don't exist for those currencies. So that's deconstruction, the sort of ability to take it apart to understand the hidden meanings. And that's an important way of thinking about discourse. And because discourse is important in international politics, because in many ways identity is discourse or discursively constructed. That there is no a priori or sort of existing meaning to things like the nation, things like Canada or the United States. Being an American or being a Canadian are ever-changing constructs that sort of evolve over time. So that there is actually a direct relationship between identity and discourse. And in many ways, if you look at something like the sort of slogan of Making America Great Again, the tension that exists is a discursive tension, right? It's a tension between sort of a conservative ideal, and not a capital C, but like a lowercase c, conservative ideal of keeping America or making America great again. That is sort of like it's something that was exceptionally great, but it has changed, so we can go back in time to a particular period to conserve the identity to where it was before to make it great again. And that is the kind of construct in Trump's sort of American identity that kind of touches on questions of race and class and being left behind. But it also is a foreign policy vessel, right? So to make America great again, there's different kinds of continuations of that. Make America great again at home, but also make America great again internationally. And internationally part is perhaps the important part for our class and for our understanding. And we understand the role of discourse and identity in international politics when we start talking about states and how states function and how states operate. Because in many ways, states use this discourse of identity to make their case, to make sort of their case in international politics. So if you think back at sort of when Justin Trudeau gets elected, the case that he makes about Canada being back is actually sort of a domestic policy that sort of has a foreign extension. Sorry. So how do we understand the role of discourse and identity in international politics? And perhaps one way to do that is through the power and knowledge relationship, which, sorry, I'm having all kinds of technical problems. All right. And power and knowledge relationship sort of would dictate or would sort of suggest that one way of doing that would be to look at sort of norms, existing norms and rules and laws in international politics. And constructivism then perhaps comes into play here, where they argue that no single future of social life is a given, and that our sort of current predicament is situated in the particular context through which we inform our actions. So we reproduce, construct our worlds into existing through discursive actions and through sort of through our actions. In many ways, then, social constructivists believe that international politics is guided by collectively or intersubjectively shared norms, rules, beliefs that then are institutionalized. And these norms, rules, and beliefs are held by the agents or by individuals or by states. So methodologically or epistemologically, social constructivism tries to find the practical answer to the postmodern challenge to scientific knowledge. So in many ways, it is actually, it is a post-positivist research agenda, but anyways, we'll talk about that in a different time, so this is not sort of particularly important for this class. So constructivists look at the interplay between structure and agency, which is something that we talked about. So rather than trying to sort of make the case that it's either structure or agency, they argue that these things are co-constitutive. They highlight the significance of identity, culture, and history, and they're interested in the role of ideas, norms, and institutions, so they pay attention to the power and knowledge relationship. And they focus on how interest is constructed. So rather than taking things like national interest or national security agendas for granted, they try to understand how those things get generated in the first place. So the assumptions of constructivism is that you can understand world politics, that if you have the right tools, you can get an insight into how things are the way that they are. So they also argue or believe that the structure-agency duality is a fallacy and that these things are mutually constitutive, so they always inform each other. And they focus on or believe in the role of norms in people's behavior. My apologies, my dog is making a noise, so I have to pause and take a look to see what is going on. Yeah, my apologies for that. So, in understanding constructivism, then it's important to understand the role of norms. The other thing that sort of constructivists look at is the idea of identities and interests. So they argue that interests are constructed and they change over time, and that identities, while relatively stable and role specific, they allow us to sort of be who we are, but like identities are informed through sort of a relational existence. So we are in a self-other relationship all the time, that we're constantly sort of changing our identities in relation to an outside force. And similarly, as we sort of talked about in the first class, it is important for me to perhaps sort of remind, if you have not seen the first class, the first module, I would recommend that you do, where we talk in more detail about these concepts of agency and structure, because for constructivists, that's an important dynamic that is always at play, to understand that there can be no agency outside of structure and no structure out of agency, so that they're constantly sort of in a dialogical relationship where they're creating each other over and over again. But to go back into that power and knowledge relationship, an important thing that comes out of it is this idea that there are international rules and norms, and that they are, like, ability to shape them, ability to inform them, are central to our ability to be powerful in international politics. So that power is not something that you simply have by, having weapons and militaries and monies. That power is one power, and oftentimes that power allows you to have a more sort of discursive power of shaping the global rules and norms. So in many ways, one can argue that contemporary international order, whether like you look at the UN Security Council, etc., is a sort of construct of the power and knowledge that the victorious powers post Second World War had about the world, so they were able to shape the world in their own sort of liking. So norms are, those are accepted values that define standards of appropriate behavior, whereas rules are principles that prompt the actors to act in a way that are defined by the rules. So rules can be regulative, but they can also be constitutive. So meaning that rules can sort of specify also what counts as an activity, and not just sort of limiting what is an activity or limiting what can be done. This takes us perhaps to one of the central norms of international politics, which is the sort of the Westphalian Order. And Westphalian Order is built upon Peace of Westphalia, or peace treaties of Westphalia. There are multiple treaties that end the 30-year war within the Holy Roman Empire. And we'll talk about next class, when we're talking about sort of the colonial origins, or the European origins of international politics, why Westphalian Order becomes relevant for the rest of the world. But the switch from empire to nation state, and this divorce of church and state, creates this understanding that there can only be one ruler per territory. So it sort of brings together the idea of territory, and bring together territory and identity in close proximity. So let's take a moment to look at Europe right after the end of the Westphalian Treaty. We will see that Europe looks quite similar, except for Italy and Germany, and that's sort of because the the nation state formation of those countries did not take place until much later. Looking at Europe then versus now, we'll see sort of the difference of what the nation states have done. Right? If we look at Europe today, you'll see that sort of the consolidation of nations. But then the question becomes, what's the difference between this map and that map? Right? So here we see, on the one hand, Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, etc. And then in the period of empires, those are not there, but they're sort of rested within the empires. And the difference is in the imperial order, the sort of the sovereignty is justified through a transcendental connection that the kings and queens have with God, versus sort of in the nation state, that allegiance is shifted to sort of supporting or protecting one's own nation. Which then, from a discursive or constructivist perspective, begs the question, what is the nation? And a brief definition of the nation is that it's an ensemble of people sharing a common living space within a distinct understanding, or with a distinct understanding that they form a unit with a specific identity. And that puts us in the sort of what's called the identities, borders, orders triangle within constructivism. So on the one hand, you have identities, and then orders and borders. So orders are the state, borders are the territory, and identity is the so-called nation. So once you align them, you create what's called the nation state. But then, this also creates existing tensions, or sort of amplifies existing tensions of ethnic nationalism, etc. So it's actually a problematic triangle. But to understand the shift from age of empires to age of states, we must understand this triangle quite clearly. But then, from a constructivist perspective, again, this begs the question, what comes first, nation or territory? And that this sort of is important because it signifies for politics, especially sort of for international politics, this idea of nation building. That sort of whether nation building happens top down or bottom up is an important sort of signifier to understand, there's different approaches, to understand different approaches to international politics. Again, this is not to sort of say the nation equals a state. And in some places, ethno-nationalism has resulted in more homogeneous societies. But in a lot of places, it's not as simple. Like Canada is a good example sort of that. And at that point, we might as well take another step back and ask ourselves, what is the state? And there's different definitions of what state might be. It could be an organized polity. It could be government. It could be a community of citizens. It could also be sort of the sovereign, the crown, or in Canada, crown. State must exercise power through a set of central political institutions, whether that's the government, the bureaucracy, etc. But it must also have a clear spatial demarcation of territory within which it exercises its powers, and that's the Westphalian order, right? One territory, one ruler. That's the sort of the modern state model. So for constructivists, that's problematic in the sense that it forces us to think about the ontological givens of the international. And then it asks the questions, what kind of international order did we create that made state as the sort of only option? And in many ways, even if you sort of take that to our imagination, the imaginary sort of fictional universe, we still see this sort of understanding of the state. Whether that's sort of the, Game of Thrones version of different houses representing different states, fighting for one sovereign, the throne. There is something appealing about the state, more than other kinds of identity and other preferences. We could have other preferences in life, but very few we would go to war for, we would kill for. So state seems to be this idea that somehow successfully created this myth that we are there for the state. And in many ways, that's important because, you can have different preferences, but you rarely see someone going and raiding McDonald's in the middle of the night in the name of the king that is the Burger King, right? So the Westphalian order is so successful because it sort of creates this sweet spot of government or governance. That it allows us to sort of feel like we belong to an entity, but at the same time, it's not too large that we feel lost. It's not too small that we feel insignificant. That state becomes sort of just the right narrative, the right level. And that has implications for international relations because mainstream international relations regard state as an essential part of international politics, that the state's essential territoriality is then taken for granted. So this understanding of inter/national relations is rarely sort of problematized. And same way that sort of space in international relations is viewed as series of building blocks defined by state territorial borders. But then international politics often ignores scales like local and global because it's just not sort of analytically useful. So as a constructivist, then we should ask, what does this approach enable or disable? And that's the discursive power, right? We're constantly asking ourselves, what does the discourse allow us to do? What does it allow us to see? What does it allow us to ignore? And in many ways, states are like containers that when we look at international politics, it allows us to see those bunch of containers, and it allows us to sort of ignore a bunch of other different avenues or sources of legitimate authority. So, to go back to the very beginning of this lecture, we can ask ourselves, what would constructivists make of the COVID-19 crisis and the responses that we have to it? Well, one way that they would look at it would be perhaps to look at what would a pandemic without borders and a response with borders do? Or turn it around. What does a pandemic without borders and a response without borders do differently than what we have? Because currently we have a pandemic without borders, but a response through and with borders. So if you take that second part of the sentence or the equation and you interpret it, what would our response would have been like if we had a single global government? Or what we had thousands of local villages? What would happen if you sort of shift the discursive scales? What would constructing global resilience look like versus having national responses? What are the internal cultures, internal norms of World Health Organization as a global actor? Or what is the impact of racism and xenophobia behind constructs like using Chinese virus as a descriptor for COVID-19? Or what is the role of fear in sort of developing global anti-vaccination movements that might hinder our ability to sort of curb the pandemic come a vaccination being, fully tested, etc. Another question that perhaps is important for this class, but not necessarily for COVID, is the potential risks and opportunities associated with placing emphasis on discursive or ideational linguistic aspects of international politics. What are we missing by just focusing on discourse and not on materiality, on practices, etc.? So that is important that we're going to always ask and question every single theory, right? So that's the critical disposition that we have towards every theory in this class. So to give you some take-home points, constructivism argues that norms and institutions matter, that sort of the main power politics happens not over sort of who has more weapons or who has more money. It happens over ability to define norms and institutions and sort of the normal behavior in international politics. But behavior is not just shaped by structure, but shaped by shared beliefs, socially constructed rules, and cultural practice. And that identity, interests, and preferences of states or actors in international politics can and do change over time, that nothing is sort of set in stone. And institutions themselves, like WHO, are embodied in norms, practices, and formal organizations such as bureaucracies, and their internal cultures matter to the outcomes. So, that's the module. I apologize that it was a little disjointed, like between sort of my dog wanting to go out and technical problems. So hopefully next week it will be better. But if you have some suggestions that you're not following something, etc., feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, hopefully sort of the synchronous model would work better. for the discussion groups. So I'll see some of you tomorrow on Tuesday and some of you on Thursday. So I hope you have a good week. If you have questions about the readings, etc., some of you have been sending emails. That's great. And if you want to sort of post those questions to the Acorn forums, that's also really good, so that hopefully maybe we can sort of have an actual sort of collective discussion and learn together. In the meantime, I hope you're all healthy and stay safe. Yeah, take care, and see you all soon.